They did not come in fire and fury. No cities burned in their wake. No armies clashed in desperate defiance. There was no great war, no dramatic last stand. Humanity did not fall with a scream, but with a whisper. The first sign was a silence. A deep, unnatural quiet that settled over the world in slow increments. A lost satellite signal. A failed transmission. A blackout in a city with no power failures. At first, these were dismissed as mere technical malfunctions, coincidences of an overcomplicated world. Then, people began to vanish. A politician missing after a speech. A scientist never returning home. An entire military base, empty overnight, with no signs of struggle, no alarms triggered. Governments scrambled for answers, but their voices never reached the public. Their broadcasts, their orders, their very presence, gone. And then, one evening, they simply stepped into the open. There were no declarations of war, no ultimatums. Only towering ships of impossible design descending like silent phantoms over Earth cities. From their sleek metallic vessels came beings of haunting beauty, tall, silver-skinned, and eerily symmetrical. They moved with unnatural grace, their onyx-like eyes scanning everything with clinical detachment. They spoke without words, their voices slipping directly into the minds of those they wished to address. Do not resist. It will serve no purpose. Some tried. There were pockets of resistance, groups of people who fought back in the only ways they knew. Militaries fired their weapons, cities rioted, and lone figures took to the streets with nothing but desperation in their hands. But their bullets never found purchase. Their weapons deactivated before they could fire. Those who attacked simply stopped. Not killed. Not harmed. Just stopped, as if their own minds had abandoned them. And in time the world stopped too. The invasion did not feel like an invasion. The world remained intact. No mass executions, no bombed-out ruins, no forced labor camps. The streets were still there. Homes remained. People went about their lives. But something fundamental had shifted. The invaders took control not with force, but with dependency. They took the power grids first, then the food supply, the water, the communication networks. They did not need to kill humanity. They merely made themselves necessary for survival. Governments dissolved, economies collapsed, but people did not starve. The invaders provided. At first, it was through small, calculated gifts, curing diseases, ending hunger, extending lifespans with technology beyond comprehension. But there was always a cost. Always a hand guiding the gift. Hospitals remained, but only those deemed efficient were kept operational. Education continued, but only in ways that suited the invaders' unknown agenda. Jobs still existed, but they were assigned now, not chosen. Cities were maintained, but under an eerie order, stripped of the chaotic energy that once defined them. Art still hung in galleries, music still played in concert halls, but only the approved pieces. The ones that inspired compliance, not rebellion. And people accepted it, because people adapt. Because fear fades, and necessity becomes routine. The human mind, no matter how stubborn, finds ways to live with the inevitable. Years passed. 5, maybe 6, it was difficult to tell. The days stretched in a monotonous, controlled rhythm. People still laughed, still loved, still had families. They still told stories. But their stories were quieter now, their voices hushed. And the invaders watched. They did not govern in the way humans once did. There was no central figure, no supreme ruler standing above all. Instead, there was a network, a collective intelligence woven between them like an unseen thread. The invaders communicated without speaking, issued commands without councils or debates. To humans, they seemed as one entity, an ocean of many waves, moving in perfect harmony. But among them, there were those who directed, who observed, who studied. Their interest in humans was not one of conquest, but of understanding. They did not merely control, they tested. They watched reactions, monitored behaviors, adjusted conditions to see what would happen. Were they curious? Or were they afraid? Whatever the answer, they did not share it. Their control was not brute force, not overt slavery, but something subtler. Compliance was encouraged, rewarded. Resistance was not punished, merely corrected. Minds were altered, memories softened, rebellious thoughts replaced with something more agreeable. And those who could not be corrected simply vanished. Yet, even in the most tightly woven nets, there are always gaps. In the forgotten places, among the overlooked souls, something stirred. A voice, a message passed in careful hands. A stolen transmission, an intercepted order. They thought humanity had grown comfortable, that their grip was absolute. But they had underestimated something vital. Humans were not creatures of logic alone. They did not operate like machines. They were messy, chaotic, stubborn beyond reason. And somewhere, in the cracks of this new world, humanity was learning. It started small. A misfiled report in an invader's database. A supply transport that never arrived. A generator failing at the wrong moment. Sabotage. Not enough to be obvious. Not enough to trigger alarm. But enough to disrupt. To remind the invaders that their control was not complete. The resistance was not an army. It was not organized warfare. It was not led by soldiers. It was the unnoticed, the ones who had been dismissed, the scientists who watched, the engineers who studied, the civilians who listened. It was the patience of an entire species, biding its time. They had conquered without war. But war was coming. And the invaders had forgotten one simple truth. Humanity does not surrender. Not forever. Not when there is still breath left in its lungs. Not when it has learned. The sky was the same. The sun still rose, casting golden light over the city's quiet streets. The air still smelled of earth after rain. The world, on the surface, remained unchanged. But beneath the calm, a different kind of war raged. Aaron stepped carefully through the marketplace, his gaze lowered but his ears open. The invaders were present, as always, but their presence had become part of the scenery. Tall, silver figures gliding through the streets like indifferent gods. They did not carry weapons. They did not issue orders. Their power was in their very existence, in the way people shifted around them without thinking, in the unspoken understanding that disobedience was useless. A woman ahead of him examined a bundle of fruit, her fingers hovering over the produce. The vendor, an older man with a lined face, watched her with nervous patience. She hesitated for too long. A silent, silver figure turned its head. She grabbed the fruit and walked away. The vendor exhaled. Aaron did too. It was a strange thing. How humanity had learned to move in this new world. Fear had settled into something quieter, something instinctual. People had learned the rules without needing them spoken aloud. Keep your head down. Do not hesitate. Do not show defiance, even in something as simple as a lingering glance. Aaron continued walking. He had learned to blend in, to move as if he belonged. The trick wasn't to act like you were hiding. It was to become part of the stillness, part of the silence. He passed a child drawing shapes in the dust with a stick. A mother whispered to her son, steering him away before a silver figure noticed. Human behavior was being rewritten. Mothers no longer warned their children about traffic. They warned them about pausing too long in public spaces, about staring for too long, about the sin of curiosity. Aaron hated that the invaders had not forced this obedience. They had not needed to. People had done it to themselves. As he reached the end of the street, a voice brushed against his mind. Not words, not sound, but something deeper, something felt. A question. A presence, pressing against his thoughts like a weightless hand. He forced himself to keep walking. That was the real danger of the invaders. Their ability to listen. It was not mind reading, not exactly. They could not peel open thoughts like pages in a book. But they could sense resistance, like a dog catching a scent. The stronger the defiance, the easier it was for them to notice. This was why the resistance had taken so long to form. You could not simply gather weapons and storm their strongholds. You could not make a rousing speech, incite the masses to action. The moment someone harbored true rebellion, the invaders would feel it. And then that person would disappear. But Aaron had learned something about the nature of control. If you wanted to escape a predator, you didn't hide. You blended in. He reached a building with a crumbling facade and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and old wood. A single figure sat near the back, a woman in a faded jacket, her hair pulled into a careless knot. She did not look up. Erin sat across from her and set down a cloth-wrapped object. "You were almost noticed," she said quietly. "They can't read my thoughts." "No, but they can sense them." She unwrapped the bundle. A small, metal device lay within, its edges crude but functional. Erin watched her reaction. No smile, no nod of approval. The resistance had no room for pride. "This will work?" he asked. "If it doesn't, we're dead." She lifted it, examining the connections. "How did you get the parts?" "Same way I always do. I listen. I watch. People don't realize what they throw away." She turned the device in her hands. "And if they catch you?" Erin leaned back, glancing at the doorway. Outside, the city continued its quiet existence. People walking, heads lowered. Silver figures moving without sound. A world asleep under open eyes. "They won't," he said. But they both knew that was a lie. Everyone got caught eventually. It was just a matter of when. The woman wrapped the device again and tucked it into her coat. "We'll test it tonight." Erin nodded. No more words were needed. He stood and left, walking back into the city that had learned to forget its own chains. Above him, the sky remained unchanged. The same sun. The same clouds. The same illusion that everything was as it had always been. But something had shifted. Not enough for the invaders to notice. Not yet. But soon. The city was not dead, but it was not alive either. It breathed in whispers, moved in hushed rhythms, its people drifting like shadows cast by something far larger than themselves. No alarms blared. No soldiers patrolled. The world had not ended in fire and ruin, it had simply changed, slipping into something more insidious. Erin moved through the narrow backstreets, his steps measured, his breath steady. The city had a way of swallowing sound, absorbing movement, turning people into ghosts of their former selves. This was survival now, blending, erasing, becoming part of the silence. The invaders did not govern through violence or destruction. They did not need to. Their presence alone had rewritten the rules. He reached the rusted service door of an abandoned warehouse, its surface scarred by time. The lock was not a problem. Locks were made for those who feared what lay beyond them. Erin pulled a slim, modified tool from his pocket, pressed it to the mechanism, and felt the vibration as it disengaged. A click. A breath. Then he was inside. The air was thick with dust and disuse, the scent of old wood and forgotten things. He slipped through the darkness, weaving between broken crates and rusted beams. No one came here anymore. The invaders had no interest in ruins. They had taken what was valuable and left the rest to decay. That was their way. At the far end of the room, a sliver of light peeked from beneath a hidden doorway. Erin knocked. 3 short taps, a pause, then 2 more. The response was immediate. The door creaked open. Mara stood in the dim glow, her face sharp with tension. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter before securing the door behind him. The space beyond was small, its walls lined with salvaged technology. Wires, cracked monitors, old circuit boards. A single oil lamp flickered atop a crate, casting long shadows against the concrete walls. 3 figures sat inside. Samuel, hunched over a bundle of exposed wiring, his fingers deft as he worked. Evie, young and restless, her foot tapping a silent rhythm on the floor. And Jonas, the oldest among them, his watchful eyes carrying the weight of too many years. Mara pulled a small object from her coat and placed it on the crate. A device, pieced together from stolen parts, fragile and unassuming. And yet, if it worked, it could change everything. "Tell me it works," she said. Samuel set down his tools and exhaled. "It should." Erin narrowed his eyes. "Should." Samuel rubbed his jaw, choosing his words carefully. "The invaders don't leave their tech lying around. What little we've scavenged barely functions. But this," he tapped the device lightly, "if we're right, it'll block their awareness." Erin frowned. "Awareness?" Jonas spoke, his voice steady. "Their connection. We know they don't read minds, at least not the way we understand it. But they sense things. Patterns, shifts in thought, deviations from their order. We believe they operate as a network, bound together by something beyond our understanding. This device might sever that link." Aaron studied the object. It looked unremarkable, small, unpolished, a cluster of wires and circuits that barely held together. But appearances meant nothing. If it did what they hoped, it could be the first real blow against the invaders' control. If it failed, it would be the last mistake they ever made. Evie shifted in her seat. So when do we test it? Mara turned to Aaron. Tonight. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of unspoken fears. There was no hesitation, no argument. They all knew the risks. They also knew they had no choice. Aaron adjusted his jacket. Where? Jonas answered without pause. The South Watchpoint. A surveillance hub. A repurposed government building where the invaders monitored movement throughout the city. No guards stood at its entrance. No locks barred the doors. They didn't need them. Humans knew not to enter. Until now. Aaron exhaled slowly, steadying himself. The plan was reckless. If they failed, there would be no trial, no execution. Just disappearance. Still, he nodded. Then we move at midnight. One by one, they slipped into the streets, dissolving into the shadows. Aaron waited until he was alone before stepping outside. His pulse was steady, his breathing even. He had done dangerous things before. But tonight, beneath the weight of uncertainty, something stirred in his chest. Oh! The South Watchpoint loomed in the distance, its structure cold and unyielding. It had once been a place of human authority, a government building where officials dictated laws, made decisions. Now it was something else entirely. A monument to control. Aaron crouched behind an abandoned vehicle, watching as Mara and Evie approached the side entrance. The city's dim lighting cast long, fractured shadows across the pavement. A single silver figure stood near the edge of the building. It did not move. It did not breathe. It simply existed. A living statue of polished metal. Jonas's voice whispered through the communicator. Wait for the shift. A moment passed. Then another. The figure turned, gliding away without a sound. Now. Mara and Evie slipped inside, vanishing into the darkness. Aaron exhaled, counting the seconds. The plan was simple. Get in, activate the device, get out before the invaders noticed the disruption. If it worked, they would be invisible to whatever unseen force governed the invaders' awareness. If it failed, they would not live long enough to understand why. The seconds dragged. Then, a pulse rippled through the air, subtle but unmistakable. Aaron felt it, a shift in the atmosphere, a disturbance that sent a shiver along his spine. The watchpoint's lights flickered. A dull hum vibrated through the night. Then silence. His communicator crackled. Mara's voice, breathless but steady. It worked. Relief coiled in Aaron's chest. He turned to signal Jonas. And froze. At the end of the alley, a figure stood. Oh, silver. Watching. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged, brittle. Then, impossibly, the invader took a step back. Not forward. Not in pursuit. Back. Aaron's breath caught. It had felt the disruption. It had sensed something beyond its understanding. And for the first time since the invasion began, it hesitated. A crack in the perfect order. A moment of uncertainty. Aaron did not wait to see what would happen next. He bolted, vanishing into the night, his pulse pounding in time with the first fracture in the invader's control. Aaron ran. The city blurred past him in muted colors, the night thick with the scent of damp concrete and distant electricity. His pulse pounded in his ears, but his mind remained razor-sharp, mapping every alley, every turn. The invader had stepped back. Hesitated. It should have pursued. It should have called for others. Instead, it had recoiled like an animal sensing something it did not understand. He didn't know what that meant. But he knew one thing. Hesitation meant vulnerability. He veered left, slipping through a rusted gate into the ruins of an old transit station. A relic of the past, long abandoned after the invaders' arrival. The walls were cracked, vines creeping through shattered windows. It smelled of dust and rain, of something once vital now left to decay. Aaron pressed his back against a pillar and inhaled, forcing his breath to steady. He listened. Nothing. The invader had not followed. He clicked his communicator. Mara. A brief pause. Then her voice, sharp but controlled. What happened? I was seen, he said. But, he hesitated. How did he even explain what he had just witnessed? But what? She pressed. It backed off. Silence. Then Jonas's voice cut through. Say that again. It saw me. It reacted. But instead of engaging, it withdrew. Another pause. Then Mara, quieter this time. Get back. Now. Aaron exhaled and slipped out of the ruins, moving with careful, practiced steps. He stayed in the shadows, avoiding main streets where the silver figures glided through their silent patrols. The city remained unchanged, but something in its rhythm felt different now, like a song played one note out of tune. The Resistance's hideout was buried beneath the remains of an old factory. Aaron reached the entrance, tapped twice against the rusted door, and slipped inside. The room was tense. Jonas paced, hands behind his back. Samuel leaned against a crate, brow furrowed, while Evie fidgeted with a loose thread on her sleeve. Mara stood near the table, arms crossed. The device they had planted at the watchpoint sat beside her, its edges still warm from use. Aaron pulled off his jacket and tossed it onto a chair. Tell me you felt it, he said. Mara nodded. There was a shift. Just for a moment. Like something shorted out in their network. Samuel's fingers tapped against his arm. That's impossible, he muttered. Their system is seamless. That's why they've held control for so long. Then why did one of them hesitate? Aaron countered. That's not normal. That's human. Jonas finally stopped pacing. We assumed they were a hive, he said. Connected. Sharing information instantly. What if we were wrong? Aaron's mind raced. You think they're not all linked? Maybe not as completely as we thought, Jonas said. Maybe there are fractures in their network. Imperfections. Evie spoke up, her voice hesitant. If that's true, what if some of them aren't as controlled as we thought? The idea settled over them like a storm cloud. The invaders had ruled for years, not through brute force, but through their ability to know, to sense deviations, to detect rebellion before it even began. Their strength lay in their unity, their precision. But what if that unity wasn't perfect? What if, buried beneath their cold, seamless exterior, there was something else? Something flawed. Aaron exhaled. We need another test. Mara shook her head. Not tonight. We wait. We observe. Wait for what? Aaron snapped. We have an opening. If we don't move. Jonas cut in, his voice firm. We don't move until we understand what we're dealing with. Aaron clenched his jaw but said nothing. They were right. Rushing in blind would get them all killed. Samuel reached for the device. I'll refine the signal. If it disrupted them once, maybe we can control how it disrupts them. Jonas nodded. Aaron, I want you watching them tomorrow. Find that invader again. See if it reacts differently now. Aaron gave a stiff nod. He had no idea if the same one would even cross his path, but if the Resistance had learned anything, it was patience. The meeting ended soon after. One by one, the others filtered out to their sleeping areas. Small spaces carved into the ruins, separated only by thin curtains. Aaron remained, staring at the device on the table. The crack had formed. Now they just had to widen it. Morning arrived the way it always did. Soft, indifferent light spilling over a city too obedient to acknowledge it. People moved with quiet precision, their actions practiced and subdued. The air carried no urgency, no rebellion, just the weight of continued existence. Aaron stood at the edge of the main square, hands in his pockets, eyes tracking the invaders as they moved among the people. Their silver forms cut through the streets like living statues, fluid yet mechanical. There was no need for intimidation. Fear had long since settled into something deeper. Acceptance. Then he saw it. The same invader from the night before. It stood near a vendor's stall, motionless, watching, but not in the way they usually did. Something about it was off. There was a stiffness to its posture, a hesitation in the way its head tilted. Aaron took a slow step forward, careful not to draw attention. The invader did not react. He took another step. Then, for the first time since the occupation began, he saw something impossible. The invader twitched. A glitch. A disruption in its otherwise flawless movements. A fracture in its design. Aaron's pulse quickened. He watched as the invader turned, too slow, too hesitant, and met his gaze. Not scanned. Not registered. Met. The moment stretched, fragile and electric. Then the invader turned sharply and walked away, disappearing into the streets. Aaron exhaled, forcing himself to remain still. The others needed to hear about this. If these things could falter, if they could experience uncertainty, it meant they could be broken. He turned and walked back toward the hideout, every step laced with the knowledge that the war had just changed. The invader had twitched. A momentary stutter, like an interrupted signal. Like it had been confused. Aaron replayed it in his mind as he moved through the morning streets, the pale light casting long, thin shadows against the concrete. The city remained quiet, its people obedient, but the memory of that hesitation followed him. These creatures were unerring, precise. Every movement deliberate. Until now. If they could hesitate, they could fail. He kept his pace even, his expression neutral. The bakery was ahead, a small relic of the old world, one of the last human-run places still allowed to function. The scent of warm bread reached him before he stepped inside, mingling with the cool air of the street. Lydia stood behind the counter, her face unreadable. No greetings, no unnecessary words. Everything in public had to remain normal. Aaron handed over his ration tokens, accepting the wrapped loaf in return. As her fingers brushed his, a message passed between them in the briefest of touches. Be careful. A warning. He gave a slight nod and left. The hideout lay beneath the skeletal remains of an old factory. Aaron moved through the ruins, slipping through a narrow, rusted doorway into the concealed space within. The others were waiting. Mara sat at the table, arms crossed, her expression sharp. Jonas leaned against the wall, silent but watchful. Samuel was hunched over the stolen device, fine-tuning its delicate components. Evie sat on the floor, restless, her fingers worrying at a loose thread on her sleeve. Aaron tossed the loaf onto the table and exhaled. I found it again. Mara's head snapped up. The same one. He nodded. It glitched. Samuel set down his tools. That shouldn't be possible. It was brief, Aaron said, stepping closer. A split second. But it wasn't just a malfunction. It reacted. It saw me, really saw me. And it hesitated. Jonas exhaled slowly. That changes things. Mara rubbed her temples. We assumed they were a hive. Perfect synchronization. No deviation. If one of them hesitated, she let the thought linger. Aaron finished it for her. It means they aren't perfect. Samuel shook his head. No. It means something is breaking. The room fell into silence. Then Evie spoke, her voice hesitant. Do you think it felt something? Aaron frowned. The way the invader had reacted, it hadn't just stopped. It had pulled back, as if it had encountered something unexpected. Something unsettling. Jonas pushed off the wall. One hesitation isn't enough to prove a larger flaw. Aaron clenched his jaw. Then we force another hesitation. Mara's gaze hardened. That's not a plan. That's a death wish. It's a calculated risk, Aaron countered. Samuel sighed. How? Aaron tapped the table. We repeat what we did at the watchpoint. Another pulse. But this time, we don't just observe. We interact. We see if we can make it hesitate again. Jonas exchanged a glance with Mara. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was a conversation in itself. Mara exhaled, then leaned forward. Where? Aaron pulled a small map from his pocket and spread it across the table. A checkpoint near the southern district. Less human traffic, but always monitored. If we trigger another disruption, we can watch their response up close. Jonas studied the map. High risk. But worth it, Aaron said. Mara sighed. We'll need a controlled pulse. Shorter than before. If they detect the disruption too fast, they'll lock the city down. Samuel nodded. I can adjust the signal, keep it subtle. But once we use it, they'll be looking for the source. Erin met Mara's gaze. Then we don't give them one. She shook her head. This is reckless. Jonas smirked. Everything we do is reckless. Silence stretched between them before Mara finally spoke. Fine. Midnight. Erin felt a tension in his chest ease. Not relief, not yet, but purpose. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were testing the invaders. The first crack had formed. Now they had to widen it. The checkpoint loomed ahead, a skeletal structure of steel and concrete. The silver figures stood at their posts, statues against the night. A handful of humans moved through, their eyes downcast, their movements precise, rehearsed. Erin crouched behind the wreckage of an old vehicle, Mara beside him. Jonas and Evie were positioned further back, watching from a rooftop. Samuel remained at the hideout, ready to activate the modified pulse. Mara checked her watch. 5 minutes. Erin steadied his breath. The plan was simple. Trigger the disruption, observe the reaction, and disappear. Jonas's voice crackled in his earpiece. Signal primed. Erin nodded. Do it. A faint hum rippled through the air. Barely noticeable. Subtle. But the effect was immediate. One of the silver figures stiffened. Its head jerked slightly, an unnatural motion. Too sharp, too wrong. A fracture in the seamless design. Erin's pulse quickened. There it was. Proof. But then, the invader turned directly toward him. Erin froze. It wasn't reacting blindly. It wasn't scanning for the source of the disruption. It was looking at him. A second passed. Then another. The invader took a step forward. Erin's breath caught. The others had never moved like this before. Their actions were always precise, calculated. This was different. This was curious. Mara's voice was sharp in his ear. Erin, move. But he couldn't. The invader tilted its head. Its silver gaze locked onto him. There was no aggression, no hostility, just something else. Jonas's voice cut in. Erin, get out now. The spell broke. Erin turned sharply and slipped into the alley, heart hammering. Behind him, the invader remained still, watching, not pursuing, just watching. He reached the rendezvous point, his breath unsteady. The others were waiting, their faces tense with unspoken questions. Mara grabbed his arm. What the hell was that? Erin shook his head. I don't know. Jonas ran a hand through his hair. It saw you. Not as a target. As something else. Samuel's voice crackled through the earpiece. Guys, you need to hear this. They turned as he continued. The signal, it didn't just disrupt them. A pause. Then quieter. It synced with something. Erin's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Samuel hesitated. I think it wasn't just hearing us. It was responding. The air in the room changed. The invaders had spent years suppressing humanity. Watching. Controlling. Tonight, for the first time, one had looked back. And it had heard them. The city had always been silent. But tonight, it felt different. The air was thick with something unspoken. A shift too subtle for the ordinary eye but unmistakable to those who had been watching. Erin could feel it in the way the streets carried an unease, in the way the silver figures moved. Not with their usual fluid certainty, but with something close to hesitation. They knew. Not everything. Not enough to act. But they had sensed the disturbance, the break in the pattern. The pulse had touched something inside them, and now they were searching. Not for a threat, not yet, but for understanding. Erin sat in the hideout, hands resting on the table as he replayed the moment at the checkpoint. The invader had seen him. Not as an anomaly, not as a target, but as something it recognized. And then Samuel's words, still circling in his head like a tightening noose. It synced with something. Across from him, Mara stood with arms crossed, eyes sharp with thought. Jonas leaned against the wall, his usual calm slipping into something graver. Evie sat curled in a chair, unusually quiet. Samuel was hunched over the device again, his fingers moving with the urgency of someone chasing an answer they weren't sure they wanted to find. Erin exhaled. Tell me you have something. Samuel didn't look up. It wasn't interference. His voice was tight, controlled. It wasn't just a disruption. Mara tensed. Then what was it? Samuel stopped working and finally met their eyes. A response. The room fell into silence. Aaron felt his stomach tighten. Explain. Samuel tapped the device, his jaw clenched. When we sent out the pulse, we thought we were scrambling their network. But the signal, it didn't just block. It reached. Something on their end answered. Jonas pushed off the wall, his expression unreadable. You're saying we weren't just interfering with them? He paused. We were talking to them? Samuel gave a slow nod. Not intentionally, but yes. A quiet, creeping realization settled over them. The invaders weren't machines. Not entirely. They weren't just a singular, unified force, operating under a perfect collective mind. There was something inside them, something individual, and it had listened. Mara shook her head. If that's true, then what the hell have we just done? Aaron leaned forward. We've done what no one else has. His voice was steady, but his pulse was racing. We've made contact. Jonas exhaled sharply. That's not exactly comforting. Evie, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. Then we have to try again. All eyes turned to her. She met Aaron's gaze. If they're listening, if they're responding, then we push further. We see how deep this goes. Mara's face darkened. And if we wake something we can't control? Evie's voice was quiet but firm. Then at least we'll know what we're up against. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Aaron stood. We don't wait. We do this now. The streets were emptier than usual. Not deserted, there were always people, moving in their quiet, obedient ways. But there was an undercurrent to the air, a collective awareness that something had changed. The silver figures moved slower tonight. Less like watchers, more like thinkers. Aaron, Mara, and Jonas moved through the back alleys, their footsteps muffled against the cracked pavement. Evie and Samuel stayed behind at the hideout, ready to monitor the signal. They stopped at an intersection near a processing station, one of the many structures where the invaders conducted their unseen work. It pulsed faintly with energy, a hum beneath the surface of the city. Aaron pressed a finger to his earpiece. Samuel, are we set? A crackle. Ready when you are. Aaron looked at Mara. She gave a reluctant nod. Jonas exhaled. Do it. A pulse vibrated through the air. This time, they felt it, not just as a hum in the background, but as a presence, a ripple against reality itself. The response came faster than before. A silver figure, just beyond the station, went rigid. Then another. Then, slowly, they turned toward Aaron. His breath caught. This was different. The last time, it had been one. This time, they all felt it. One of them stepped forward. Aaron braced himself. The others tensed beside him. But the invader didn't attack. It didn't issue a warning. It stopped, tilting its head, studying him. Then, in a movement so human it sent a chill down his spine, it raised a hand. A gesture. A question. Mara whispered, Are they acknowledging us? Jonas didn't answer. Aaron, heartbeat hammering, took the smallest step forward. He lifted his own hand, mirroring the movement. For a breath, nothing happened. Then the invader did something no one had ever seen before. It spoke. Not in words. Not in any human language. But in sound. A resonance. Something felt more than heard. A vibration that passed through them like an unspoken thought. And Aaron understood it. Not with logic, not with language, but with something deeper, instinctive. A simple message. You are not what we expected. The moment stretched. The invaders remained still, watching, waiting. Samuel's voice crackled in his earpiece, breathless. Aaron, what the hell did they just say? Aaron swallowed. His mouth was dry. His mind reeled, but the answer came without hesitation. They weren't expecting us to fight them. His voice was almost hollow. They were expecting us to break. Mara inhaled sharply. And now? Aaron stared at the invader, at the glint of something unreadable in its dark eyes. Now they don't know what happens next. It was over as suddenly as it had begun. The invaders did not attack. They did not retreat. They simply watched as Aaron and the others backed away, their gazes unreadable, their forms still as statues. The moment they returned to the hideout, Samuel was already standing, wide-eyed. "You understood them," he said, voice a mixture of awe and something close to fear. "How?" Aaron shook his head. "I don't know. But I did." Jonas sat heavily on a crate. "Then this isn't a war anymore." Mara frowned. "Then what is it?" Aaron exhaled. "A conversation." Silence. Then Evie spoke, almost a whisper. "They weren't here to kill us. They were here to see if we could survive." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. "Then they were testing us." Aaron met his gaze. "And we just gave them their first wrong answer." A beat of silence. Then Jonas let out a breathless, humorless chuckle. "Well," he muttered, "now we see if they pass our test." The city remained still. The invaders remained watching. But for the first time since the occupation began, humanity had spoken back. And the invaders had listened.